Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of US Society. Just wanted to give you my weekly overview of some of the things you're going to be seeing this week. There is a lot of content. I included lots of different video links, and I also included lots of optional links, especially related to race and incarceration and police violence. But there's so much more reading you could do on both the topics of gender or race. We do have classes in the Department of Sociology on both of those. So if you're really interested in some of the topics you see this week, I definitely encourage you to take other courses. So let me just jump right into it because there's a lot of material. So I want to start, I'll talk briefly about race. Some things are very challenging, I think, right now to talk about when it comes to race, since we did just have the interaction with the campus police officers and the shooting of Jason Washington on our campus. And so I think that that's something that's probably in lots of people's minds. I do encourage you to continue to follow the news, and I gave you a resource on the D2L page about the Portland State University Student Union. I think they're doing some work around this, so if you're interested in getting involved, they're the best place I could think of for you to go. And it should be noted that this book, this is the second edition, so it's more recent, but I don't think it's able to take into account some of the most recent things related to race in the United States that I would think are relevant. So I included just a couple of little things on a slide about police violence more generally, and then also there's a link to an optional article for you to read from The Atlantic about white nationalism, which is a term we keep seeing as we see lots of these kind of white supremacist folks organizing in greater and greater numbers around the country. So I think those are just things that we want to be aware of and be thinking about in relation to some of the topics for this week. This class as a whole, this textbook is really trying to give you this foundation for understanding race and ethnicity and gender. And so I do want to remind you that sociologists consider race to be this socially constructed category. So that means it's not something we think is founded in a biologically meaningful basis. It's really more something that through our interactions with each other over the course of time, that's how we start to think that gender becomes socially constructed or race becomes socially constructed. It's the other people around us. It's our kind of things we inherit from our society or our socialization that really gives those categories meaning, not that there's some sort of really, really critical biological difference. One way that I think that it's really easy to understand how race is socially constructed is we just think about the changing nature of race over time. That I think it's a book that's called How the Irish Became White, but it talks about how, in the early part of the 1900s, we would have lots of immigrants coming over to the United States, and they would be Irish immigrants, and they were classed or given a racial category that was very different from a more privileged white status. And so thinking about how the group of Irish, or the category of Irish, over time changes to become part of the group of white people. So thinking about how something like that changes over the course of maybe 50 or 60 years. And so we can then say, okay, but we want to call into question what these categories mean in the first place. The little video that I gave you on the social construction of race also points out that the U.S. Census itself defines race in different ways. Even as recently as 2000, I think, is when they expanded the number of racial categories. So even the way that we're defining race and even how we're measuring it changes over time. So that's a really good indication that something is socially constructed. If it's not consistently the same over the course of 100 years, we're going to maybe call into question the essential nature of that category. I cannot do justice to the historical nature of racial oppression in U.S. society in 2 minutes in a lecture. I put a slide in here talking about A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. He's a really well-known historian. It's a very long book, but if you're interested in sort of getting a better sense of some of our problematic practices in the United States related to slavery, to genocide, to our imperialist practices in other parts of the world, I really recommend either excerpts of A People's History or just reading the whole thing. It's definitely something that can give you a better sense of some of the historical practices that were playing out in the past. And it's also sometimes very useful, I think, during times when we see a lot of disruption like we do at the moment related to immigration, related to police, related to even gender at the moment, right? There's lots of these disruptions that are happening, and I think it can be useful to go back and look at historically what are some of the things that have happened, how have some of those things changed or been resolved. So we're in this kind of critical and interesting moment in U.S. history, so I think it's always useful to go back and see what's happened in the past. In terms of the book, they're really trying to give you this foundation, however, of understanding, statistically, how can we look at and understand racial differences and racial inequality. So they talk about a number of different forms that inequality might take. I gave you a couple of slides on household poverty, wage inequality, unemployment, and a lack of wealth. Those are just specific measures we would have that could say, okay, we know that there are groups in the United States who are not doing as well as other groups. We refer to that often as stratification. So we know that there are a huge range of reasons why people are not as likely to have the same levels of income, have the same levels of wealth. A quick note on the vocabulary there, when we're talking about income, that's kind of how much money you make hourly or per week or annually, versus wealth, which is all the stuff that you might have. That could mean you own a car, or you own property, or you have stocks or bonds or something. I don't know if anybody has bonds anymore, but be thinking about how wealth is all that stuff that you have there. So what's really interesting when you think about racial inequality in the United States is that we might look at income inequality and think, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But then when you think about wealth inequality, there's that disparity between white Americans in the United States and Black Americans then becomes this really kind of much larger picture of inequality, because people of color in the United States historically have lacked the access to mortgages, discriminatory practices in lending, all kinds of other sort of restrictions and constraints on where people could buy houses. That contributes to this lack of wealth over time. And wealth is usually something that is kind of hereditary, right? If your family owns property, then it's much more likely that you could maybe ask them for money to buy your own property. That like owning a property, owning of a home becomes its own source of wealth that can then be shared with future generations. So really, when we're talking about these things, we might not be as concerned about income inequality because it might not be this huge number. But when you think about the wealth inequality, that's when we start to say, okay, there's limited life chances here for generations of people. I also think it's helpful to remind ourselves of the legacies of slavery, of Jim Crow, that those are not so very far behind us. It seems like, oh, that was the 1800s or the early 1900s, but again, because these things can be intergenerational, it really does mean that over time, families and communities of color have just lacked the ability to accumulate wealth and to pass it on to other generations. Now we're starting to see, over time since the 1960s, 70s, 80s, we've seen an increase in the Black middle class in the United States, but many times we're not necessarily seeing the accumulation of wealth to the same extent that white individuals in the U.S. had historically been able to. We also need to think about, of course, I keep talking about black and white because I think the book kind of highlights some of those disparities. But we certainly, through all of these, I want you to be looking at the very specific ways in which poverty rates and income inequality are stratified by different racial groups. So Latinos in the United States, Native Americans in the United States, all have different kind of histories of racial oppression, and so that I think also tells this larger story of a lack of wealth, a lack of income equity, a lack of higher educational outcomes that were similar to white Americans. So thinking about how these things tell this story, it's not just this thing that happens in a vacuum, right? It's a thing that happens in relation to long-standing historical tendencies and historical practices in the United States. Okay, so this is just like 300 years of U.S. history, but what I want you to take away from some of these statistical analyses are just really how entrenched some of these differences have been over time, and that yes, they ebb and they flow, but for the most part we are seeing real stratification among different racial groups. I've started to include in the lectures a larger section on mass incarceration and race. I think that's because sociologists and criminologists both have been really interested in talking about and researching the increase in incarceration rates and the disproportionate impacts that incarceration has on people of color. And so I did include a little John Oliver for some fun. I apologize if he swears. It's John Oliver, but I do think he always does these really, I think he's a secret sociologist. He does some interesting analyses that I think are useful, and hopefully, despite the state of the prison system, hopefully it's a little more lighthearted if we're hearing it from John Oliver. I did include a couple of other clips that I do really want you to watch. The Marc Lamont Hill clip I think is really useful for just reminding us again, really briefly and succinctly, the disparities that are disproportionately impacting the Black community in the United States. And then I also include a really short clip from Bruce Western, one of the authors of the extra article that you should read this week that's on that invisible, cumulative, intergenerational notion of what happens when you incarcerate large numbers of people in the United States. Finally, there's a really short YouTube clip for you to watch here by Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Enduring Myth of Black Criminality. And I also put some optional reading there. I almost assigned just the entire article instead of the book chapter, but it's called The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration. It's a really interesting chapter because it's talking about lots of the different systematic ways that racism is played out in the United States and how that has kind of gotten us to the point where we have such a large prison population. Okay. I'm already at 10 minutes here, so I'm going to just keep on keeping on. That is pretty much all I can say about race. That's ridiculous. I'm sorry. There's only a couple of weeks in this class. But I do encourage you to take other classes that talk about race, that talk about ethnicity. The School of Gender, Race, and Nations has plenty of courses that should keep you busy if you're interested in these topics. When it comes to gender, there's so much more you could be talking about that we get to even think about in this class. The book itself is really because the folks who wrote it are interested in data and statistics and telling us kind of how do we demonstrate gender inequality. That's really what we're seeing here. But gender and sexuality class that we offer would be much more likely to be thinking about the range of different kind of issues. You might be talking about sexuality, you might be talking about gender identity and expression and all kinds of other issues. Here we're really kind of talking about these more heteronormative, right, so things focused on sort of these traditional binary categories of men and women and looking at statistical inequalities amongst them, which is important, and a lot of sociologists do that work. So we're really focused on that particular part of the sociological study of gender here. What I think is important for you to recognize is just that, this is all sort of changing, or has been changing for the last few decades, that more and more women have entered the labor force in the United States. Women are getting more college degrees. They're, in all kinds of different professions at this point. But despite that, we're still seeing disparities in pay. And I want to remind you, there's a fun little slide in here, the gender pay gap visualized, but it just talks about how these things are intersectional, right? They're the stratification of the wage gap is a real thing, right? That white women still do better in the wage world than women of color do. And so thinking about how even though there's a gap between white women and white men, if you're a woman of color, that gap becomes even larger. So being aware of the fact that these are not sort of static things, that it just depends on a variety of different identities, what that gender pay gap might look like. I also want to remind you that these things that the United States is increasingly much more focused on these sort of state level differences. And so I did include a wage gap map that looks at this disparities across states. And so I think that that's also really indicative in some cases of what the overall picture of gender equity is in the United States. Some parts of the country, the wage gap is much higher for women than it is. For example, if you take a look at this, you can see that the wage gap is women in Oregon earn between 75 and 77.9% of what men earn. So that puts us sort of a little bit below average, the average kind of gender gap or wage gap across the country being a little bit smaller. Yes. Sorry, there's wage gaps, and then we're talking about the percentage of what someone earns. Okay, so to quickly try and wrap this up, I do want to keep this in a larger context here, that the United States is kind of this consistent theme. Wright and Rogers' drive home for us is that the United States is not doing great when we compare ourselves to other countries. And so you'll see if you look at the gender equality kind of index where it ranks different countries, we're ranked 20th. We're not number one. There's a lot of different things that other countries have done to really try and ensure gender equality more consistently. Some of those things have to do with things like parental leave or subsidized childcare, things that would typically keep women out of the workforce, out of the paid workforce. And so there are different ways that has something to do with it. There are also places that gender equity gap, or the gender index there, is trying to measure, how many women are part of political systems, how many women are in elected office, these kinds of larger questions about representation and the role or the extent to which women have political power. So those are all really interesting questions I think for us to think about. I also included a side just about women in elected office in the United States, just because I think it's interesting to look at the fact that we may be making some gains when we're talking about the representation, the more equal representation of women in elected office. But at the same time, we're still, if you look at these little circles, you don't see a huge amount of it. We're not anywhere near like a 50% of those positions being held by women. We have a long way to go if we think that kind of representation is important. Okay, so the last few things I'll try and say, because this is already 15 minutes, just thinking about the fact that Wright and Rogers are trying to get us to understand that there are specific structural reasons why some of these changes have occurred. The changing nature of family structures, the decline in people's interests in getting married or having children at a younger age, the professional development that continues. So people are getting more advanced degrees or want to have more career experience before they get married. All of those things kind of have an impact on the way these family structures change over time. I also do want to point out, this is again not a huge component of this particular chapter, but they do talk about changes in views on same-sex relationships or on same-sex marriage, and so I think that those are things that are interesting. Same-gender marriage, but be thinking about the fact that those things have only recently, right? Only in 2015 did that Supreme Court decision come into effect, where people could get married at any state in the country, regardless of what their gender was. So that's a really recent change, and potentially something that, because it has been decided by courts, is up to being challenged in the future. So be thinking about how some of these things are recent changes and potentially have the possibility of being altered in the future. I also want to point out that we can't even get into it in this class, but there's one slide on sexual violence and harassment. We know that these are things that happen in our community, on our campus here in Portland, right? That sexual violence, sexual harassment are things that are high profile, high interest topics of the moment, but they have historically always been problems in the United States. And so there's really not any justice I could do to talking about that topic here, except to say that it's worth taking another class on. I sometimes teach a sociology of family violence course. So if that's something that you see offered, I would love to have any of you take that, where we could talk more in depth about some of the kind of sociological reasons why we see high rates of sexual violence and harassment in the United States. Okay, well, here we go, gender. 5 minutes. I want to remind you to read both of those articles, the Western and Pettit article on mass incarceration, and then the masculinity article by C.J. Pascoe, the Do Girafag article that's actually a short version of her book. And I just want you to be thinking about that sort of role that masculinity plays in contextualizing and how people are expressing their sexuality. And I think that we can learn a lot about that like how we think about homophobia, how we think about violence, how we think about masculinity all together by reading this article. Finally, please keep reading Righteous Dope Fiend. I know that the material itself can be challenging, especially when you're reading all these disheartening things in this book, and then you're seeing disheartening things on the news, and then you're having to read disheartening ethnographic accounts of drug addiction. But I do want you to be thinking about these big concepts of biopower, governmentality, and neoliberalism. Governmentality, I think, is it's a concept from Foucault, and it's a really interesting way in which Foucault theorizes that the kind of infiltration of the government into our lives in this really kind of I keep doing this insidious sort of way, means that many times what has happened, what Foucault argues has happened over time, is that people actually begin to do for themselves the things that the government historically had done. So that would be something like healthcare, right? Historically, if the government, that's not happened in the United States, but say historically it was the job of some other larger structure to provide social supports or a social safety net or some kind of healthcare provisioning. But then we see people internalizing that and saying, well, this is something the kind of individualization of responsibility. I've got to take care of all these things myself. It's entirely up to me to do this. The whole kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. Neoliberalism, it's not super well defined in here, but I think of it as a sort of a political and an economic practice. So it's sort of a political mindset that says growth at all costs is important. Capitalism is the best and most efficient way of organizing our economic system, and that we should sort of like privatize and deregulate everything to the best of our ability, because then the free market will function well. So neoliberalism is both this sort of political philosophy that says capitalism is great and growth at all costs is important, but then it's also a bunch of very specific economic mechanisms that say, yes, let's deregulate, yes, let's privatize things, let's reduce any of the social safety nets that exist, let's invest in corporations. So it's kind of all these sort of very specific economic practices. So think of it as both of those things, economic and sort of political, almost like a philosophy. And I would say, in case you're not clear, most of our recent presidents would fall under this neoliberal category. So Reagan, both Bushes, Bill Clinton, Obama, and Donald Trump, to the best of my understanding. Sometimes hard to know what his philosophy is, but that being said, we would definitely see the United States really engaging and embracing these kind of neoliberal policies and economic practices since at least the Reagan era in the 1980s. Okay. Yeah, that's all I can do in 21 minutes is talk about the history of racial oppression, gender inequality, neoliberalism. You got it all here, folks. But I do encourage you to try and keep up with the readings as best you can. This week 3 is focused on these two kind of major themes, gender and race. But next week you get a whole kind of host of different topics that we have to try and cover. And so next week can feel a little intense in terms of the kinds of topics that you're supposed to be taking a look at, and the fact that you're also going to be writing your book analysis for this book. So with that, I'll leave you. And please, if you have articles or things you want to share with the class, post them on the D2L discussion board or drop me an email. Thank you.